The tension in the cabin was palpable as Megan stood just outside the first-class door, staring at the last-minute addition to the flight manifest. She had just finished her pre-flight checks, ensured the passengers were settled, and was about to head back to the galley when the final name caught her attention. Donald Trump. For a moment, she thought it must have been a mistake. After all, why would he, a billionaire with his own fleet of private jets, be flying commercial on a regular American Airlines flight? It didn't make sense. But there it was, written in bold black ink. Trump, first class, seat 2A. She couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to this flight. But that curiosity quickly turned to confusion as she glanced at the rest of the manifest. There was no mention of any special arrangements or private accommodations. He was just listed like any other passenger. It had to be a mistake. The rest of the boarding process went by like any other day, with passengers slowly filling the first-class cabin. Megan, accustomed to the routine, moved down the aisle, greeting familiar faces, but when the last group began to board, she saw him. There he was. The unmistakable hair, the polished suit, the swagger. It was like a scene out of a movie. But it wasn't a movie. It was real life. And for a moment, Megan froze. She had expected celebrities on flights before, actors, musicians, CEOs, but never him. Never Trump. The man who'd built an empire, had been president, and was now standing in front of her like he had all the time in the world. "Miss, I'm supposed to be in first class," he said in his signature drawl, his voice commanding yet casual as he glanced around the cabin, completely oblivious to the stares he was receiving from the other passengers. Megan cleared her throat, trying to steady her nerves. "Of course, Mr. Trump. Let me just check the manifest for your seat." Her hands were already flipping through the papers, but her mind was racing. She knew exactly who he was. No one didn't, but this was her job, and she needed to remain professional. She couldn't afford to let the celebrity status intimidate her. It wasn't until she checked again that a cold knot formed in her stomach. He wasn't on the list. She scanned the manifest again. He wasn't listed for first class. In fact, he wasn't listed for anything at all. The name Trump wasn't even on the plane's official seating chart. Her pulse quickened. She had to be missing something, right? It didn't make sense. But there was nothing. No reserved seats, no special arrangements. There were no notes, nothing that would explain why he was standing there, exuding his signature air of superiority. Just him, and the empty first-class seat that was now taunting her. "Mr. Trump, I'm so sorry, but I'm afraid you're not listed for first class. We have you down for seat 18C in economy," she said, trying her best to keep her voice even, though the words felt foreign coming out of her mouth. She knew how this sounded, how it might make him feel, but the truth was the truth. Trump looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he were trying to size her up. Then he smirked, a look that made her gut twist. "Are you sure about that? Because I'm quite certain my ticket was for first class." He raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting her to back down. Megan wasn't one to back down, though. This wasn't about the passenger. This was about the rules. "I'm sorry, Mr. Trump, but there's been some kind of mix-up. I'll see if we can find an available seat for you in first class, but I can't just move someone out of their seat." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at the empty first-class seat, then back at her, as if the situation were beneath him. His lip curled into that smug, familiar smile, and he leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping in volume, but not in intensity. "I'm not asking. That seat is mine. You'll find a way to make it work. It's my seat." Megan's mind raced. This wasn't normal. Even celebrities, even CEOs, knew when to take a step back and accept what was offered. But not him. He was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. She could feel the pressure of his gaze on her as the other passengers watched, all eyes on her, waiting for her to give in. She swallowed hard, keeping her hands steady as she glanced at the other passengers in the first-class cabin. There were a few vacant seats, but none of them were open for this kind of situation. She had a job to do, and her job wasn't to accommodate power plays. "Mr. Trump, I'm really sorry, but I cannot let you take that seat," she said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "You have to follow the same rules as everyone else." His eyes flashed with something cold, something dangerous, but he didn't back down. Instead, he took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. The air felt charged. You don't know who I am, do you? Megan held her breath for a moment, refusing to let herself show any sign of weakness. I know exactly who you are, she said, meeting his gaze. But that doesn't mean I can bend the rules for you. The words hung in the air between them, the tension thick enough to slice through. Megan could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest, the entire cabin holding its breath. She wasn't sure how this was going to play out. She had never been in a situation like this before. It was one thing to handle a demanding passenger, but it was another entirely to refuse someone like him. He didn't speak for a moment, simply stared at her, sizing her up as if trying to gauge her worth. And then, in the most casual tone imaginable, he spoke again, like the power he wielded was a simple fact of life. You'll regret this, he said, his voice low and chilling. The words were simple, almost harmless, but Megan felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in the way he said it, something that made her stomach churn with unease. Before she could respond, he turned on his heel, a small but deliberate gesture, and walked toward the back of the plane, leaving Megan standing there, her heart still pounding in her chest. The passengers began murmuring softly, casting nervous glances in her direction, unsure of what had just happened. The atmosphere had shifted. What was supposed to be just another routine flight had just become something entirely different, and Megan could feel it deep in her bones. This was far from over. She had just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the world. Megan's hands trembled slightly as she walked back to her post by the galley. The last few minutes replayed in her mind, each one feeling more surreal than the last. It wasn't just the words that Trump had said. It was the way he'd said them, as if everything he did and said was a command that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't the first time she'd dealt with difficult passengers, but this situation felt different. The tension in the air was palpable, and the whispers from the first-class passengers made it worse. She could feel their eyes on her, each one judging her, wondering why she hadn't just let him have the seat. At first, she tried to push the feeling down. It wasn't personal, right? She had done her job, refused to bend the rules, and that was that. But every time she passed by the aisles or glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Trump was sitting in an economy seat, something gnawed at her. The way he'd looked at her, the words he'd left her with, "You'll regret this, star." She had tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just the typical arrogance of a rich man. But deep down, she felt something worse was coming. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It wasn't even about the flight. It was about power, control, and making sure that she understood just how little power she had in this situation. And she was starting to realize just how deep the cracks in the system went. The flight passed uneventfully for the first few hours, but the tension didn't subside. Megan's nerves were on edge, her eyes constantly darting toward the back of the plane, where Trump sat, occasionally glancing out the window, his face impassive. At one point, she went to check on the business class cabin, and when she returned, she found a note slipped into her seat. It wasn't much, just a simple, folded piece of paper with no name on it. But the words inside were enough to stop her cold. I hope you realize what you've done. I'm sure we'll have a nice chat soon. You'll need to explain yourself. He doesn't take well to this kind of treatment. The handwriting was elegant, but the meaning was clear. The power dynamics had shifted, and now she was in the middle of something much bigger than she had anticipated. Megan's hands were shaking as she folded the note back up, trying to act as if nothing had happened. Her mind raced. He doesn't take well to this kind of treatment. What did that even mean? She had made a simple decision based on her duty, her responsibility to her job, but clearly, that wasn't enough for Trump, or whoever had written that note. The rest of the flight was a blur. She tried to maintain her composure, but the passengers' stares were getting harder to ignore. She heard a few murmurs, bits of whispered conversation. Some passengers were still in business class. Some had already moved to economy, and they all seemed to be waiting for something to happen. She couldn't stop the growing unease in her stomach. Each hour that passed felt like it was inching her closer to something she couldn't control. She went to the back of the plane to check the restrooms, but as she stepped into the galley, she found herself face-to-face with one of the senior flight attendants. Rachel, a woman who had worked at the airline for almost a decade, gave her a knowing look. "You're the one who had the run-in with Trump, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low, as if she were trying to keep the conversation private. Megan hesitated before answering, her mind still spinning. I didn't want to make a scene, but he insisted on a first-class seat. And when I told him there wasn't one available, he didn't take it well. Rachel nodded, but there was something in her expression that made Megan uneasy. You didn't just refuse him a seat, did you? She asked, her voice cautious. Megan furrowed her brow. What do you mean? I followed the rules. I'm just doing my job. Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair as she looked over her shoulder to make sure no one else was listening. Listen, you're new to this, right? You think this is just about seating assignments? With Trump, it's never that simple. People like him don't get told no very often. I've seen it happen before. And let me tell you, he doesn't forget. Not ever. Megan's throat tightened. What do you mean he doesn't forget? Rachel glanced around again, her voice dropping to a near whisper. This isn't just about his ego. This is about control, power. He doesn't take well to anyone, especially someone like you, standing in his way. She paused for a moment, looking around one more time before continuing. The thing is, Trump plays dirty. He doesn't lose, not in situations like this. If he's pissed, and if he's got a reason to make your life miserable, he will. And trust me, he'll find a way. Megan felt her pulse race, the gravity of Rachel's words sinking in. She'd just done her job. That was it. She hadn't caused trouble, hadn't done anything to provoke anyone. But here she was, being warned that a powerful man might make her life a living nightmare for nothing more than refusing to cater to his demands. She wanted to speak, to argue back, but the words stuck in her throat. Rachel's face softened a little, as though she realized how much she had startled Megan. Look, I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm just trying to make sure you know what you're up against. In this job, you've got to know how to deal with these situations. He isn't going to play by the rules. You shouldn't expect him to. Before Megan could respond, there was a soft chime from the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your trays are stowed. Rachel turned back toward the front of the cabin, but not before she gave Megan a hard, knowing look. Good luck, she murmured as she walked away. Megan stood there for a moment, processing what she had just heard. He doesn't forget. What kind of person was she dealing with? What kind of power did Trump wield that could make even the most experienced flight attendants like Rachel so uneasy? The rest of the flight went by in a haze, Megan's thoughts racing as she moved through the aisles, completing her duties as best she could. But nothing felt right anymore. That note, Rachel's warnings, it was all too much to shake off. She had been warned that something was coming, and she was beginning to fear just how far he would go to get even. The plane finally landed, but Megan felt no relief. As the passengers began to disembark, she knew that this wasn't over. She had no idea what was waiting for her, but she was sure of one thing. The real battle had only just begun. Megan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even after the plane had landed in Los Angeles, even after the passengers had slowly filed out, she still felt it. There was no immediate confrontation with Trump. He had disembarked in his usual manner, taking one last glance back at the cabin as if to remind everyone who he was. But Megan knew better. Something was brewing. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. For the next few days, she tried to go about her normal routine. She returned to work, focusing on the tasks she could control, preparing meals, greeting passengers, and ensuring the flight ran smoothly. But there was always a gnawing sensation in the back of her mind. Every conversation, every glance in her direction seemed charged. She couldn't help but think it was all connected to the incident with Trump, though no one had spoken about it directly. It wasn't until Thursday afternoon that she began to understand just how deep the consequences were. She was standing near the gate when a well-dressed man approached her. His posture was perfect, his suit crisp and neat. He had the air of someone who belonged in a boardroom, not at a crowded airport terminal. His shoes were polished. His watch gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal. He smiled at her with a warmth that seemed too rehearsed, almost as if he were trying to convince her of something she wasn't sure she believed in yet. "Are you Megan Clark?" he asked, his voice polite, yet commanding. Megan froze, caught off guard. She glanced around, but there was no one else nearby who looked like they were expecting her. "Yes, that's me." she replied, trying to hide the uncertainty in her voice. Can I help you? The man's smile remained, though it seemed to carry an edge now. I'm David Green, he said, extending his hand. I work with Mr. Trump. He asked me to speak with you. Megan's heart skipped a beat. She felt her breath catch in her throat, and for a moment, she was back on that plane, standing face to face with him, watching his cold smile. The man before her seemed entirely too calm for the gravity of the situation. I don't understand. What exactly does he want? Megan asked, her voice coming out firmer than she expected. She had spent days trying to push the whole encounter out of her mind, trying to return to her work, to focus on the mundane tasks that helped her forget how much she had let that moment affect her. But now it was back, crashing into her like a wave. David Green tilted his head slightly, his eyes gleaming with a sort of understanding. He didn't seem to be in a rush, which only unsettled her more. Mr. Trump isn't one to let things go, he said, as if the words were a matter of fact. And, well, he's asked me to ensure that you understand the situation. It's not personal, Megan. It's just business. He simply wanted to make sure you were aware that your actions didn't go unnoticed. Megan's skin tingled with a mixture of anger and fear. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what he meant. He was threatening her, or at least trying to intimidate her. But it was different this time. This wasn't just Trump acting on his own. It was someone else. Someone who had come to clean up the mess, to remind her who held the power. I did my job, Megan replied, forcing the words out between clenched teeth. I didn't do anything wrong. David Green nodded slowly, almost as if he were assessing her. Of course, he said, as though the idea that she could have done anything wrong was laughable. But the thing is, actions like yours have consequences. Mr. Trump doesn't forget these things. He doesn't forget when someone questions his authority. Megan felt a sudden urge to push back, to yell, to make him understand that she hadn't done anything wrong. But she also understood something more clearly now. She was out of her depth. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. This wasn't just about a flight. It was about something bigger, about power, control, and the kind of person who wielded it like a weapon. And she, standing there, was just another pawn in his game. What are you saying? Megan asked, her voice low but steady, hoping to hold onto some shred of dignity. What is it that you want from me? David Green didn't hesitate. We want you to understand that your actions have consequences, and that you should expect certain adjustments in your professional life. You might want to consider being a little more mindful of who you cross in the future. A chill ran down Megan's spine. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. It was the kind of thing you heard about in stories. Those whispered rumors of people who had gotten on the wrong side of the wrong people. She was starting to realize that this wasn't just some business transaction. This was a warning that was going to follow her. The ripple effects of her simple decision to deny him a seat had just begun, and she wasn't sure how far they would reach. But then, just as Megan's world started to spin with uncertainty, she noticed something strange. David Green's gaze shifted for just a moment, the smallest flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't a look of sympathy or malice. It was something else, something almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it gave her pause. She narrowed her eyes. "You're not here to threaten me, are you?" she asked, her voice colder now. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, a defiant spark she hadn't expected. "You're here because you want something else, something more than what you're saying." David Green didn't respond at first. He simply studied her, his face unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice dropping to a lower, almost confidential tone. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Megan," he said, his words slightly slower now. "Listen, I'm not here to make things harder for you. If I were, I'd have already done it. What I'm telling you is this. There's more to this than you realize. And if you want to survive this, you need to know who you're really up against." Megan's mind raced. The words didn't sit right with her. He wasn't threatening her in the way she had thought. He was offering something. Something different. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. David Green glanced around quickly, his expression hardening again. "I can't say too much, but I can tell you this. Trump's not the real threat here. If you're smart, you'll figure out who the real players are." With that, he turned on his heel, leaving Megan standing there, feeling more confused than ever. She was left with more questions than answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. What had David Green meant? Who else was involved? What was she really up against? The only thing Megan knew for certain now was that she had no idea what kind of game she had just entered. But she was about to find out. Megan couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, tossing and turning, her mind replaying the encounter with David Green over and over again. His cryptic words echoed in her head. Trump's not the real threat here. She couldn't make sense of it. What did he mean by that? She had thought the worst part of this whole mess was behind her. The tension with Trump, the threats, the subtle intimidation. But now she was certain that she was only seeing the surface of something much bigger. She had no idea who the real players were, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. By morning, her thoughts had only become more muddled. She had gone over everything David had said. He hadn't offered her an out, but there had been something in his eyes, something that made her think he was trying to warn her. It wasn't until her shift the next day that she realized just how deep into this mess she had already been pulled. It was the following afternoon when Megan was called into the operations office. She had been expecting a quiet day, one that involved serving drinks, checking on passengers, and avoiding anything too intense. She hadn't been prepared for the sudden summons. It came over the intercom as though she were just another employee getting called for a routine check-in. Megan Clark, please report to the operations office immediately. Thank you. Her pulse quickened. She had worked at the airline for months now, and she had never once been called into the operations office. She tried to calm her nerves as she walked through the narrow hallways of the terminal. The last time she had been in that office, it was for a standard safety briefing, nothing out of the ordinary. But this felt different. It felt like the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. She knew it. When she stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind her with a soft, final sound. There were two people sitting at the desk, one she recognized and one she didn't. The familiar face was her manager, Linda, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who always seemed to be on top of everything. But the other figure, the man sitting next to her, was someone Megan had never seen before. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair slicked back in the way of someone who was trying to look both polished and intimidating. His eyes, though, were what unsettled her the most. They weren't warm or welcoming. Instead, they were calculating, cold, and appraising her as if she were something under a microscope. Megan, Linda said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Have a seat. Megan hesitated for only a moment before sitting down. She could feel her hands begin to sweat, her throat dry. What's this about? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Linda's smile faded slightly as she exchanged a glance with the man beside her. We need to talk about your actions on the last flight. Specifically, your interaction with Mr. Trump. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Megan's heart sank. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement. Linda already knew everything, and the man beside her clearly wasn't here for a casual conversation. He was here for something much more serious. We've been monitoring the situation, Linda continued, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. And we've been getting complaints. Several of the passengers in first class filed reports about how you handled the situation with Mr. Trump. Now, we don't want to jump to conclusions, but you've been flagged. Megan's mind raced, her chest tightening with anxiety. Complaints? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What exactly are they saying? The man beside Linda spoke for the first time, his voice calm, but with an edge that made Megan uncomfortable. Let's not play games, Miss Clark. We know what happened. You were the one who refused Mr. Trump a seat in first class. You're the one who defied him. Megan's eyes widened, and she clenched her fists on her lap, trying to steady herself. I didn't defy him. I did my job. I followed the rules. I wasn't going to just move someone out of their seat because of who he is. The man's lips curved into a slight smile, but there was no humor in it. It doesn't matter what you think you were doing. What matters is what Mr. Trump thinks. And right now, he's not happy with you. That's not something anyone here can ignore. Megan shook her head, feeling a surge of frustration. I didn't do anything wrong. Linda sighed and looked at the man beside her again. You may not have done anything wrong, but the truth is, you don't understand how things work around here. This is bigger than just you. This is about how we handle situations, about maintaining control and making sure that no one steps out of line. She paused, letting the words sink in. And right now, you've stepped out of line. Megan felt as though the walls were closing in on her. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared to be confronted, to be told that everything she believed in, doing her job, following the rules, wasn't enough. It wasn't about fairness. It wasn't even about right and wrong. It was about power, about who controlled the narrative. And right now, that wasn't her. The man stood up and took a step closer to her. Listen, Megan, I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. You've been flagged for review, and that could mean trouble for your career. But here's the thing, you still have a choice. If you want to keep your position, if you want to keep your job, you're going to need to play along. You'll need to make amends with Mr. Trump, and we'll help you with that. All you need to do is apologize. That's all it takes. Megan's throat constricted, and she felt a sudden wave of dizziness. Apologize? To him? To Trump? After everything? It was like asking her to betray herself, to bend to someone who didn't care about anything but his own power. But as she looked at Linda, who was watching her with no trace of sympathy, and the man, whose cold gaze never left her face, Megan realized something. This wasn't just about her career. It wasn't about keeping her job or playing along. This was about the principle. This was about standing up to something that wasn't right, even if it meant facing consequences she couldn't fully comprehend. She stood up, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. I won't apologize to him, she said, her words clear, even though her heart was racing in her chest. I did my job. I don't owe him anything. The man's expression faltered for just a moment, before his eyes hardened again. Very well, he said coldly. We'll see how this plays out. Megan didn't flinch. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. She knew what was coming, but in that moment, she realized something important. She was no longer afraid. Megan walked out of the operations office, feeling a strange calmness settle over her. She had expected to feel more fear, more anxiety, but there was none of that. Instead, she felt something that surprised her. Relief. Relief that she had made her stand, that she had refused to buckle under the pressure, even if it meant her future at the airline was uncertain. The air felt different as she moved through the terminal, the constant hum of activity now seeming distant and muffled, like she was in a bubble of her own making. She had no illusions about what was coming next. The man in the office had made it clear that she had crossed a line. She would be scrutinized. She would be watched. And if they had their way, they would destroy her career to teach her a lesson. But despite the gnawing uncertainty about what this would mean for her, Megan knew deep down that she had made the right choice. She couldn't let herself be intimidated, couldn't let them use her to prop up someone else's power. She wasn't a pawn, and she wasn't going to pretend she was. For the next few days, the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that eyes were on her from every corner. Every time a higher-up passed her, she caught them glancing in her direction, their eyes darting away as soon as they realized she had noticed them. She tried to go about her work as usual, but there was a palpable weight to her every move. It wasn't just the airline anymore. It was everything, the political landscape, the people in power, and the games they played. It was all connected now, and she was right in the middle of it. One morning, just as Megan was preparing for her shift, she received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway, curious despite herself. Megan Clark? A voice asked, one she didn't recognize but immediately felt she should. Yes, this is she, Megan said, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. She had no idea what this call would bring, but she had learned to be prepared for anything at this point. This is David Green, the voice on the other end said. I'm sure you remember me. We need to talk. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. After the conversation in the terminal, she had assumed he would keep his distance, maybe even let things settle. But the fact that he was calling now, after everything that had transpired, made her uneasy. About what? Megan asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. It's not about the airline anymore, David said, his tone serious. This is bigger. We need to meet. In person. I can't explain it over the phone. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. But something told her she needed to hear him out. She couldn't afford to ignore anything at this point. All right, Megan said finally. Where do you want to meet? A few minutes later, they arranged a time and place, an upscale coffee shop near the airport. It was a neutral spot, somewhere Megan could blend in with the crowd. She didn't know what to expect, but she was certain of one thing. This conversation would determine everything. When Megan arrived, she spotted David immediately. He was sitting at a corner table, his usual immaculate appearance intact. As she approached, he stood up and offered her a brief smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. She sat down across from him, her mind already racing with questions. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said, settling back into his chair. He glanced around the cafe, his eyes scanning the room briefly before returning to her. "I won't waste your time. I'm here to tell you that the situation you're in, it's not what you think." Megan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? You've already said everything that needs to be said. You told me what I'm up against. I'm not sure how much more I need to hear." David leaned forward slightly, his expression intense. "No, you don't understand. It's not just about Trump. It never was. The man you crossed? He's not even the one pulling the strings. He's just a puppet. And I'm not just talking about him. There's a whole network, people in positions of power who are playing a game you don't even realize you're a part of. If you thought your job was the only thing at stake here, you're wrong." Megan's pulse quickened. Her stomach tightened with the realization that this wasn't just about her career. It was about something far more dangerous. "So what am I supposed to do about it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've made it clear that I've crossed a line. What happens now?" David's gaze softened for a moment. "There are two ways this can go, Megan. You can stay in the dark, keep doing what you're doing, and hope you can ride this out. But that's not going to work. Sooner or later, they'll get to you. You'll be swallowed whole by the system. Or you can choose to fight. And I'm not talking about a petty fight. I'm talking about something that could change everything." Megan's mind was spinning. She had always been the type to keep her head down, do her job, stay out of trouble. But this was different. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was trying to understand the rules of a game she hadn't even known existed. "What are you offering me?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with suspicion. She wasn't sure whether she could trust him, but she was desperate for answers. David leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "I'm offering you a chance to take control of the situation. You can't fight these people alone, but together we can expose the truth. We can turn this game on its head." Megan studied him for a long moment. She didn't know if she could trust him. But one thing was clear. If she wanted to get out of this alive, she couldn't do it by staying in the dark. She had to know who the real players were and how they were playing the game. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. "What do we need to do?" David's lips curled into a faint smile. "It's time to start fighting back." And just like that, Megan knew her life was about to change forever.